Mrs. Albania, Marinella Chapati. Mrs. Alberta, Mrs. America, Nicole Swerking. Mrs. Austria, Ava Zellhofer. Mrs. Australia is Shabani Yar. Mrs. Bangladesh, Pia Vipasha. Mrs. Botswana, Olebele Daphne Muzila. Mrs. Brazil, Gabriela Araujo. Mrs. Cambodia, Jacqueline Bogota. Mrs. Canada, Solange Taishi Makita. Mrs. Costa Rica, Sarah Morales. Mrs. Czech Republic, Jennifer Stoke Fillmore. Mrs. Ecuador, Vivian Garcia. Mrs. England, Bethany Stevens. Mrs. Estonia, Katlin Londa. Mrs. Ethiopia, Rhonda Wolford. Mrs. France, Dr. Patricia Celan. Mrs. Germany, Kelly Burns. Mrs. Ghana, Ellen James. Mrs. Greece, Nicole Karpa. Mrs. Haiti, Ludwig Norsilus. Mrs. Honduras, Monica Cartagena. Sargam Ghoshal is Mrs. India. Mrs. Indonesia, Cynthia Hermawan. Mrs. Ireland, Jessica Marie Hopper-Landrum. Mrs. Japan, Hiromi Mine. Olivia Constance Nicholas is Mrs. Malaysia. Mrs. Mexico, Joanna Morales. Mrs. Liberia, Veladar Curry. Mrs. American, Christy Clark. Mrs. Navajo Nation, Maureen Mink. Mrs. Nepal, Diksha KC. Mrs. Nigeria, Ray. Mrs. Norway, Valeria Yertines. Mrs. Paraguay, Luz Model. Mrs. Peru, Cristina Delgado de Cabrera. Mrs. Philippines, Adeline Pepino Yambao. Megan Kakahihiba Akim is Mrs. Polynesia. Mrs. Portugal, Nicole Sigler. Mrs. Russia, Yana Tropimova. Mrs. Scotland, Jacqueline Dunham. Mrs. Singapore, Cindy Lin. Mrs. Slovakia, Lucia Kolesarova. Mrs. South Africa, Joe Judnick Wilson. Mrs. South Korea, Dea Payet. Sri Lanka. Sweden. Switzerland. Mrs. Tanzania is Dr. Namrata Shah. Pimquan Bujipimo is Mrs. Thailand. Precious Piper Derrick is Mrs. Trinidad and Tobago. Pamela Serena is Mrs. United Arab Emirates. Lean Clive is Mrs. United Kingdom. Mrs. Ukraine, Tatiana Chubak. Elizabeth Paris is Mrs. Venezuela. Nguyen Tai Bishan is Mrs. Vietnam. Zambia,